given the fact that we've got experts from Northern Europe and Denmark, Klaus to Central Europe, we've got Darian based out of Prague, all the way down to New Zealand. We've got Paul Gestro there, and Paul, obviously, I'd love to know about what's going on in New Zealand. There's obviously lots of good stuff that we hear, and as I mentioned earlier, I mean, this is some of the smartest people that I've worked with. It just so happens, and it's probably given the representation of the sample, 4 out of 8 people here are Kiwis. So I'll just say probably the smartest bunch of people on the planet anyway. So Paul, if you had any thoughts on what you're seeing in New Zealand, because New Zealand's a trade economy, and given your background in as a diplomat, as a trade finance, as a leader in that trade finance sector, and you've been a technology leader yourself, I mean, what are the implications you're seeing on trade? And is this really going to set the tone for digital trade going forward? I mean, we hear a lot of that from New Zealand anyway, but is that the way forward?
Well, it's just been a heck of an interesting time, hasn't it? And it's getting more and more interesting day by day. And we're about 4 hours away from going from level 4 down to level 3, which just means the same thing, but McDonald's will be open. So it's changed. Yeah, it's not going to change a heck of a lot, but a lot of people will be out buying McDonald's in about 4 hours' time.
Well, it's close here in Singapore.
Yeah. So and it's different. Every country's different on how they've approached it, and it's caused different stresses through the economy in different industries. Obviously, New Zealand's a major export economy. If you go past the tourism piece, once you close borders, it ends tourism. So, no use talking about that one. But what's been interesting to me is probably the 3 things that have come up the most when I've talked to most of the exporters has been, one is that whole supply chain, right from where you get your goods to make what you make, then how you're going to make it, because we've got employment issues, or people be able to make your product, right through to your export, and what that market will look like, because the market's going to change remarkably. Who you thought your customers were now will be totally different in the future. So there's a bit of a confusion about that. The second part, as you mentioned, digital. Obviously, digital is a huge part of it now. No matter what market you're in, e-commerce was a nice to have, or good to have. Now it's almost a must have, particularly for primary producing companies. And the third part's capital. How you can access capital to go to market again, or just to run your business. The third part, the capital part's been sort of pretty well documented by banks and government to sort that out. But a lot of companies under stress, obviously, moving forward, and what that looks like. But interesting enough, when I've spoken to a lot of exporters, I thought that their first thing would be about where the heck is my export market, what it's going to look like, how am I going to capture that market. But what they're actually talking about the most, it's actually probably the last thing they're talking about. Most of they're talking about is how they're going to make their product. There's still social distancing. So if you go to any pack house producing milk, dairy products, etc., these are factories with long lines of people that do certain processes along the way. Of course, now there's obviously distancing in those factories, which has caused a whole new innovation aspect, because now they've had to re-engineer their whole lines to allow for this sort of social distancing along the packhouse lines, for example. So when you've got a major export economy like New Zealand, that's a big part of your economy changing the way they do things, and of course, how they get people to be employed in these places as well, not right from harvest right through to production. So that's changed remarkably. The digital part is a huge part because of e-commerce, as I've mentioned before, but more than that, on the whole digital trade aspect and trading goods offshore, this whole, the fintech was sort of supposedly could have almost said shot out of nowhere post GFC. This is now another sort of renaissance of fintech, because in the digital trade area, in trade, the documentation is such a major part of that there's a lot of face-to-face contact, checking the documents, a lot of people getting together and signing things off and passing things on. People can't do that at the moment. So, the evolution of digital trade is going to accelerate now, because you're going to need to do that process without people around you, and speed that process up through digitization. So there's a huge, pivot and change of the way companies operate, right from the production level, right through to how they sell the goods on e-commerce and different platforms, and then through to how they transact that trade through the traditional channels, but potentially now much more digital.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And look, I think you touched on how our exporters looking to the number one concern is how they're going to produce, right? And actually, we do have a session coming up over the next couple of weeks on agri-tech, and how the agricultural landscape is going to change. And again, just ironically, because there's so many smart people in New Zealand, it's Janet from our team in New Zealand that's going to be talking about it. I pretty want to switch gears to sort of emerging markets, a market like India, and because you've had a background in both payments and in insurance, a couple of decades in leadership roles in that sector in India. And I know that you've talked about this to Paul when you guys were here for the Singapore FinTech Festival. But from what Paul was talking about from FinTech, I mean, what are you seeing as implications in India, in a market like India? Because that's a different scale altogether.
Yeah, absolutely, Amit. And I would tend to agree with Paul on his views. While all of us are aware of the sectors which are negatively getting impacted, like tourism, travel, restaurants, but there are emergence of various sectors which are seeing a huge uptake, which is going to be very helpful for the fintech industry. Primarily, it is on over the top. It's an online gaming, online education, online praying. I mean, online praying has all of a sudden gone up. Online donations, small grocery shops. That's becoming very big.
There is a lot happening in India just on online praying. I think that's what you need to look after a billion plus people. You need the prayers.
Yeah, online praying. The PM Care Fund, which the Prime Minister had initiated, has seen online donations going up big time. And this has also helped a major penetration in tier 2, tier 3 countries, cities. So it's a very interesting space. And with the government, the Reserve Bank of India insisting that currency can be a carrier of the virus, it's giving a huge push to online payments.
And I mean, we haven't touched on one of the sectors. I think that just anecdotally, my sense is that there's a lot of people who are not insured who are looking to get insured with what's happening right now from a health insurance standpoint. I mean, how do you think that sector is going to deal with just this whole digital movement?
Amit, thanks for bringing that up. And I was just about to add to Klaus and Andy's view on where they spoke about work from home, they spoke about employee engagement. I would put it as an employee motivation and put health insurance very, very high in that sphere. Primarily, health insurance is, apart from individuals buying their own individual policies, a lot of them rely on the employer insurance. A huge uptake because of the COVID-19 crisis, which has made people much more aware on the benefits of health insurance. It also sees employees coming back to the employers, because primarily employers negotiate very good terms and conditions with the insurance companies. And they would come back and say, one is, please give me a top-up cover. I'm willing to pay for my pocket, but I know I can get a good deal from you. Point number two is they would want to go up and cover the parents, cover the families. And point three, it will also move from a traditional health insurance cover to things like hospital cash, critical illness covers. So it's going to be a very, very interesting space to watch out for. And InsurTech is going to play a very big role. Players like Echo and GoDigit in the last year has reported a growth of 130% plus against an industry average of 12%. So InsurTech will play a very big role in ensuring the entire distribution or awareness or a larger crowd, given that social distancing will be a norm for the coming days, restricting the physical force to meet people. So definitely health insurance will be a very exciting space to be.
So we are going to see a disintermediation of that whole agent landscape. And I guess that's where technology will come in, digital, this whole digital enablement, but then also a lot of, to Klaus's point earlier around learning and skills, new skills being learned. So just, as we've talked about, the industry is evolving. We've talked about supply chain. We've talked about how I guess exporters are looking to streamline the production first. So with that, I want to take a question to you, Darian. You've spent over a decade in probably one of the strongest brands that are related to automation in general, IBM, and then prior to that, you've had over a decade as an analyst. I mean, talk to us about the role of automation and how are businesses going to respond to this and what should they be doing?
Yeah, sure. So I think a lot of the automation benefits, cost, quality, and speed are fairly well documented. But the crisis is starting to show that it also offers resiliency during workforce disruption. So we've got a small but growing number of dark factories around the world. So these can operate without much human intervention for a period of time. So they're obviously still operating. But there are also a lot of organizations that have factories or warehouses that aren't fully automated, and they still enable social distancing. So these are fairly modern factories that have cobots, where you have a robot and a human working collaboratively. So this would avoid the need for multiple people in one place. But at the same time, there are a lot of challenges, which were mentioned earlier. So you might have a high level of automation in a warehouse over here, even significant areas around a warehouse with all the picking and packing, but you also need a lot of workers, and they might congregate in spaces like break rooms or just clocking in and out or traveling around on buses. So these are the sorts of things that simply need to be resolved in low-tech ways, even in highly automated places. I think there are probably some other challenges. So a lot of these factories, even the dark factories, they're often suited to very long runs, which produce one good or multiple goods, but for a very long time. And they may have trouble shifting gears to meet consumer demands. So, I mean, if you were shopping for flour recently, you would have seen empty shelves. And it wasn't that there was a shortage of flour, it was just simply that there weren't small enough bags. They were all restaurant-sized bags. And organizations needed to change production quickly just to meet that sort of demand. So not only do you have to be automated, but you also have to be agile. And we're starting to see companies doing that. So in Europe, where I live, Zara, H&M, Adidas have shifted quickly to making masks because they couldn't sell as many clothes. Siemens is 3D printing medical device parts. So really changing quickly in an agile fashion to meet new demands. And then I think McDonald's has already been brought up. I think we'll see, once restaurants do reopen, we've already seen a lot of kiosks and mobile ordering in fast food, but I think we're going to start seeing chain restaurants rolling that out more. And maybe you'll even see these robot waiters becoming more than just a novelty. They might even be used to ease the minds of diners. Obviously not mainstream, but you might see it creep in a bit more. So it's very industry dependent, but I think once the dust settles, we'll see a lot more automation.
So Andrew, with what Darren was just talking about from an automation perspective, is this the opportunity for certain industries to just seize the moment and go for it?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've been seeing a general trend anyway towards automation and AI being in areas where basically it makes sense. But I think having a situation now where social distancing is becoming important and gatherings of people is being discouraged, and this is likely to continue in the post-COVID-19 era, it's obviously going to speed up. So, we've been talking about software-defined factories for some time. Basically pretty much everything on a factory floor been automated and controlled through some central console or dashboard, and I think that's really going to start becoming a reality in certain countries. You've got a lot of it already. So I know that in Germany, a lot of this kind of production and manufacturing is pretty well advanced, but I think we really will start seeing it being speeded up as organizations really don't have any other choice. And yeah, it will have profound geopolitical implications, because the kind of attitude that, say, North America and the UK have had towards manufacturing is that basically you outsource it to where it can be done more cost effectively, and basically that means where the cost of labor is lower. I think we may start seeing a situation where manufacturing, well, I shouldn't say start, we're already seeing it, where manufacturing comes back from low-cost locations and back to closer to of demand. And I think that'll be an obvious implication of greater automation. So, why do your manufacturing in the low-cost location when you're no longer getting the labor arbitrage benefits as it becomes more automated? And so we'll certainly see big manufacturing centers like Germany and Japan and South Korea bring a lot more of their manufacturing back onshore. So I think it'll have very profound implications. This move towards greater automation, at least in the manufacturing sector, and we could talk about it in other sectors too.
Yeah, no, thank you.
Could I add to that? There's been a lot of talk about that manufacturing as part of, certainly from a supply chain perspective. A lot of talk in Europe, a lot of talk in the US about moving manufacturing closer to the source, or to where it's needed, in order to deal with these cutoffs in supply chains that we're seeing now with coronavirus to some degree. And then, yes, I think there is certainly a move towards moving more of the production to closer to home. But I also think that it will depend on automation for that to work in the longer run, because once we get 6 months beyond this period we're in now, I think money starts to talk again, and companies will always go back to where is the cheapest solution. And if that's China, it's still going to be China.
Yeah.
I think.
But I think, but if you are automating most of what you do, the location becomes less important.
Absolutely. I think it'll depend on automation to happen.
Yeah, that's true. I think a lot of German manufacturers have demonstrated that by still being leading manufacturers despite the competition they've had from lower cost locations.
So we may still see toys for our kids going forward coming out of Denmark, as they used to be in our parents' time. Right? Some of the best toys from Denmark. We might
Lego still being produced here.
Just talking about kids, I know we're coming to the close of this, and I am going to come back to each one of you just quickly. But Klaus, one of the highlights for me in one of the team catch-ups that we have was when Klaus was actually dropping his daughters off to school. He was doing a school drop-off on that video call, which was really refreshing. It was a lot better to say hello to his daughters than it is to speak to Klaus. I think it was very refreshing. But just a great example of how pervasive all of this has gotten into our day-to-day lives, right? But so if you look at just the education sector as such, I mean, you and I had a chat a couple of weeks ago about the whole e-learning space, and it'd be great to get some thoughts from you on what's going to happen there.
Well, certainly for grammar schools, what we've seen in Denmark, and I know a lot of the Nordic countries, probably around Europe, if not the world, is this has actually highlighted how ill-prepared schools were for remote learning. It took more than a week for the first video calls to go through. And even so, the extent of e-learning was just some group chats on Zoom or on Microsoft Teams, etc. I think, especially talking from a Nordic perspective, the Nordic region is very much about courses. If you're public sector, and that includes teachers, if you haven't had a course in something, you can't do it. Which means that the issue hasn't necessarily been the lack of technology, because everybody had the technology to do it. The issue was the lack of ability and know-how among teachers to use remote learning tools. And that's certainly something that's been highlighted in this crisis. And it's only around now that they've started to put together how they can actually deal with remote learning in some of the older classes that haven't gone back to school yet. So I certainly foresee in the next few months, there'll be a lot of course activity in the public sector as a whole in how to use remote learning, how to use remote working tools more effectively. There's a lot of grumpy parents around who felt they had to be too involved in their kids' learning, and that the teachers weren't carrying their part of the burden to the extent they could have been. I don't know how it is in, I could imagine New Zealand might be better because you're smarter apparently, but it would be nice to get some other perspectives on that.
Well, I can tell you, talking about grumpy parents, I mean, Paul and I both have teenage kids, so I think we're generally grumpy anyway. But, you know, Paul's daughters go to one of the best grammar schools in New Zealand, yeah, Paul? And
yeah,
what's your experience?
It's been pretty patchy, I suppose, but they've actually just sort of looking into using technology for leadership. Daughter's a senior at school, and so she's involved in leadership groups, but they've taken the bull by the horns and started doing virtual assemblies where they've got all the prefects together to do assemblies for the kids, and almost taken over the reins from the teachers because they're a lot more technology savvy than the teachers are. Many teachers are, of course, and they're almost putting out more of a community, good spirits, kind of let's all in this together kind of feel, which is a great asset for the school when the teachers are scrambling behind trying to catch up with the online learning piece, but the kids are sort of taking over control of the whole network in some respects. So it's good to see those kind of things pop out, you know, just a different way of learning and getting messages across using technology, which, you know, rather than sort of a, you know, one-to-one or one to a few, you know, one to thousands literally. So it's been interesting.
Yeah. Now, and look, I think just to plug in for New Zealand again, I do it shamelessly. New Zealand, I think, responded very quickly in terms of dealing with sort of the digital divide between the haves and the have-nots and the underprivileged kids, right? I know for a fact, Stuart Wakefield, who's the CIO for the Ministry of Education, I mean, they basically, literally, within a week, made provisions to make broadband accessible, as Liam pointed out, but also devices accessible to kids that didn't have access to those facilities.
So I was just going to say on that, on the education and the societal shifts. I mean, I know my mother's a teacher, and she's noticed, like within the online teaching and stuff that she's done, suddenly there's been quite a shift. Some kids that struggle in the classroom have started to really thrive, maybe because they're a bit more introverted or things like that. And so, yes, it's been a massive challenge doing it all within 4 weeks. Suddenly, the schools weren't ready for this type of stuff. But if it gives a leg up for them to be more, to have more options for teaching, basically moving forward, they're not going to, you know, carry on just kids staying at home. But you've got different ways of teaching kids rather than just shoving everyone through the same line moving forward, then that's a positive coming off the back of this as well.
On a lighter note on the education side, it just helped us to reduce the bills because all the unnecessary fees which was pulled in as a part of the fee structure is getting off. And the advanced quarterly fees are getting reduced to monthly, so that's on the lighter side.
Well, not for us here in Singapore dealing with the international school fee, I can tell you that. Thank you everyone. Thanks for taking the time, and really enjoyed the session. For our viewers and the users of Ecosystem's platform, we will be running a host of these sessions. This is the expert version. We'll be running sessions with which we are running with industry leaders and business leaders, and how they deal with some of the challenges and how they're navigating to thrive for the future.